Good morning out there in religious studies land. I'm once again trying to keep the energy up. I'm David Robertson.
And I'm Christopher Kotzer, and we are the Religious Studies Project, brought to you as ever by the BASR, NAASR, and IAHR. And NASR will be meeting right at this very moment at the AAR conference in Boston. So hello to them and hello to all the delegates.
Indeed, and many of our BASR chums will be there as well.
Another BASR chum is the chum who's coming up in this interview. It's George Chryssides. He was speaking to Breann Fallon about changing your story, assessing Exmember narratives.
Yeah, a development of his earlier podcast, one of our first podcasts ever, in fact, on the insider-outsider problem in the study of religion, something which I'm no doubt will be being discussed at AAR right now. So without further ado, let's pass over to Breann and George.
Exmember testimony can be difficult to deal with. Such testimony tends to receive privileged treatment in anti-cult literature, while some academics are prone to be sceptical, even suggesting Exmember testimony is worthless. So how do we deal with such testimonies, especially considering the increasing forms of such testimony that now comes with social media? What role do such accounts play in the creation of identity for ex-members? To discuss this topic, I have with me Dr. George Chryssides. Is that how I say your name?
Chryssides.
Chryssides. Okay, I'll do that again. To discuss this topic today, I have with me Dr. George Chryssides. George is a long-term friend of the Religious Studies Project and is Honorary Research Fellow at York St John University and the University of Birmingham, having been Head of Religious Studies at the University of Wolverhampton from 2001 until 2008. He has written extensively on new religious movements, especially Jehovah's Witnesses. Recent publications include the Historical Dictionary of Jehovah's Witnesses, the Bloomsbury Companion to New Religious Movements, co-edited with Benjamin E. Zeller, and Jehovah's Witnesses Continuity, and Change. George is co-vice chair of Inform, the Information Network on Religious Movements, based at the LSE, and was founded by Eileen Barker in 1988. George is also on various editorial boards and panels, and is currently co-editing an anthology entitled The Insider-Outsider Debate, together with Stephen Gregg. He is also editing an anthology for the Routledge Inform series entitled Minority Religions in Europe and the Middle East. So thank you very much for joining us today, George.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So I was wondering if we could just start with a discussion of how different scholars deal with ex-member testimonies and what your opinion is of those different sort of ways of dealing with such testimony.
Well, there are inevitably a handful of scholars who support the anti-cult movement, although they don't like it being called the anti-cult movement. But there is a body that is somewhat hostile, and they tend to privilege the ex-member. They will say the ex-member has been inside, now he or she is outside. So they've seen it from both points of view and are in a better position than someone like myself that has never joined a new religious movement. So that's one point of view. There are others like James Beckford who say, well, if you've come out in a new religious movement like the Jehovah's Witnesses, then your testimony is going to be biased. Maybe you're going to be a bit embarrassed about having been involved in a group that's not very popular and has an unusual worldview. So you devise some kind of explanation about how and why you joined and how you got disillusioned and how you were conned into joining maybe and how you were deceived and so on. So James Beckford thinks that the ex-member devises a scenario, as he puts it, to account for entry and exit. There are other scholars like Lonnie Cliver and Brian Wilson who have said their testimony is totally invalid. We should just disregard it totally. It's worthless. Now, I don't go along with that either, because I think particularly when you read written ex-members' accounts, okay, they're biased, but we're always taught to evaluate our sources. So it's important to see why they're saying what they do, what it is that might be true, what sounds plausible. You triangulate your information, what other people have said. Very often you can get unwitting testimony about conditions within an organization. There's a lot of good material you get, particularly from high-ranking ex-members, people that have, for example, in one case, been on the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, they don't publish their minutes or anything like that. So until Raymond France's book came out, I don't think any of us had much of a clue what actually went on in the governing body, how they voted on things, what sort of topics they discussed. And that's really interesting. We shouldn't just say, well, that's ex-member, he got cheesed off with the movement, we're not going to listen to it, because that way you would lose an awful lot of very good information.
So there's sort of this element of the fact that's behind the supposed fiction that we can kind of draw out from testimonies, I guess.
Yeah, well, fact and fiction tend to kind of blend into each other. Actually, that's some work I would like to do as a piece of follow-up research for my work on JWs, because there are a lot of narratives, and it's a pity I didn't get my act together on this before this particular conference, which is on narratives, because you get some narratives that claim to be absolutely factual. You get others that are on their own account works of fiction. The stories invented about Jehovah's Witnesses. And then in between, you get pieces of, some people call them faction, that are cross between fact and fiction. And they'll say, well, this is based on such and such a congregation, but we're not telling the reader who it is because of confidentiality. And actually, there is a wealth of literature there about what it means for a Jehovah's Witness to be out doing house-to-house work, staffing a literature cart and things like that. And in some cases, how they fudge the statistics that they report back to their elders. And I think things like that are really fascinating, because you can't get that in copies of the Watchtower, for example. So that's a future project, reading up on the fiction, faction narrative and seeing what one can get out of it.
So how do you think that we should be dealing with ex-member testimonies, in your opinion?
Well, what I'm presenting at this conference is the view that ex-member testimony is about one's identity, right? Because you can have different identities depending on what your interests are. Okay, so, maybe you kind of dabbled in a hobby for a couple of weeks and got fed up with it. So that's not part of your identity. And there are some people that actually go along to a new religious movement in that kind of role. They'll maybe go along for a couple of weeks, or maybe just the once, and then decide it's not for them, or decide they don't like being out at night, or something like that. And we don't hear so much of these testimonies because they're not very interesting. Where a religion is not part of one's identity, you don't need to invent a story about why you came out. I mean, I don't need to invent a story about why I gave up stamp collecting or something like that. So, on the other hand, if the religion has been a big part of your identity, maybe it's been your paid employment even, then you're going to have problems coming out. You're going to have to think, how do I shape a new identity? And it can be really practical things that are involved, like how do I get a job? Where will I live? Who are my friends going to be? Because maybe some of them will keep up with you, but probably most of them won't. So it's a whole new life that you're inventing in that sort of case. So people have to find ways of doing that. In some extreme cases, the ex-member has actually made ex-membership part of his or her own identity, perhaps being a so-called cult counselor. There are people that have made their professions out of that. Not all that many, but you tend to hear about them more than the others because they're prominent. They've got a lot to say about the movement. And there is a saying, you can get the member out of the cult, but you can't get the cult out of the member.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's true about these people. Actually, they're very good informants, some of them. You know, if you can get them tamed and talking to you. There are a couple that will send me lots of extremely good information about the Unification Church. So, usually if I want to know something, I will write to them and to say, I've heard about so-and-so, what do you know about it? And then I'll get back a lot of good information. Kind of mentally, they're still in the movement, even though in terms of what they believe, what they practice, they're out of it.
So in that sort of way, you're finding these testimonies really useful. Do you think there's a difference between different types of testimony? So we already talked about fact and fiction, but you know, a biography as opposed to writing to your ex-members that you are familiar with, as opposed to, you know, perhaps something on social media. Is there a difference between using those different types, do you think? Is there one you prefer?
Absolutely. I think a lot of stuff that's not terribly worthwhile, the stuff that you get on bulletin boards from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of it is misinformation. A lot of it is actually very hostile. And even the treatment that they're getting in Russia, which is quite appalling. I don't know if you've been following that at all. But the authorities have closed them down and confiscated all their properties. And on some of these anti-JW sites, you're getting people saying, wish they had done it sooner.
Wow.
I mean, there's no kind of sympathy for these people, whatever their beliefs might be. So there's not a lot of point in reading much of that kind of stuff, except that it tells you more about the person that's writing than about the movement itself. But on the other hand, there are some very good ex-members that can give you some good information.
Definitely. I think we should delve more into this idea of identity and creating that sort of, I don't know what you would call it. Do you think they create an ex-member persona?
Some of them do. I mean, I can decide, I guess, if I'm an ex-member, whether I want to make a feature out of that, whether I want to tell people, yes, I was a Jehovah's Witness, and this is very much part of my life having been one. Now, actually, I do know of one former JW elder who has actually become a Church of Scotland minister.
Oh, wow.
Now, I don't know much about him, but I can see that somebody could make a feature out of that and to say, well, that's been my past life, but now I've kind of seen the light, or however he wants to put it. I have heard of one other Church of Scotland minister who served a long prison sentence as a murderer, and then he repented and made good, and evidently he makes a feature out of that because it's got a good biblical message about conversion. You know, Paul writing to the Corinthians, I think it is. No, it's the Romans, if I've got it right. He lists a whole lot of misdeeds that people committed, and then he says, and some of such were you. So it's all very biblical if you want to do it that way, to say, well, that's my past life, but now it's all changed thanks to Jesus Christ or whatever. That's one way of creating your new identity. Another way of changing your identity is simply to conceal it, to say, well, yeah, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm just going to get on with my new life. So there are different ways of creating this new identity. But one way or another, if a religion has been a major part of your life and you're coming out, then there is an identity problem. You do need to think, well, who am I? What do I want to be? And how do I want to shape up this new life that's lying ahead?
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
Do you think that, as scholars, we need to be sort of aware of this identity change when we're looking at ex-member testimonies, how they've how they've come out of whatever movement they were a part of and how they've sort of transitioned into, whether they've been really open about it, whether they've concealed it and then been open about it? Is that something we need to take into consideration when looking at these testimonies and which ones we really should be looking at for evidence?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, because evaluating your sources means asking questions like, who is telling me this? What is their motivation? How much knowledge do they have? Sometimes people can pretend to have more knowledge than they really do about the movement they're in. A lot of ex-JWs will say, well, the society has got a history of failed prophecy. No, I don't think that's true. That's a popular myth that is propagated by ex-members. I'm not saying they've never ever revised a date or given it a new meaning, but there's one website that I think goes through every year from 1877 when I think the society was first getting going, and then giving some kind of prophetic statement they made and how it failed, and that's not really correct exposition of what they're saying. So yeah, I think we do need to ask what is the degree of knowledge that this person has, because there can be a view that if you've been inside, you know all about it, and I think anyone that follows a religion doesn't know all about it. You can't know all about your religion. It's just too big a subject.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a bit of a left field question at you that I didn't tell you I was going to ask.
Oh, dear.
We always get this sort of image of ex-members coming together and then forming like an ex-member group.
Yes.
Has that come across in your work a lot?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of that. And I think that's part of forming a new identity, because you need to have friends. Friends need to have things in common. And the obvious thing in common that you've got if you're an ex-member is being an ex-member. So, yeah, there are JW groups. I've been invited to go to one or two of their events, but I kind of feel I'd be gate crashing. But, they get together from time to time, and I'd be interested to know what they talk about, because they often say you don't have to talk about Jehovah's Witnesses if you come to our meet. Now, whether they actually do talk about JWs or whether they talk about some other interests that they've got, I don't know. But that would be interesting. But yeah, that's part of shaping your identity to get an ex-member group going. Of course, I think the ex-member group is more a kind of phenomenon in itself that is worth noting if you're a scholar. I suspect that in the ex-member group, you get a kind of snowball effect of all the kind of moans that they've got about the Watchtower Society. I see some of their stuff on Facebook, and that seems to be kind of how it works. So somebody will put something on, maybe about Russia, and then somebody will add a rude comment about it, and it tends to kind of further the kind of lack of sympathy.
It'd be interesting to look at how like social media has played a role in creating those new ex-member groups, because of course social media, people from all over the globe can come together and sort of share their stories. Do you think social media has had a big part in Exmember testimony and getting that out there?
Absolutely, yeah. There are one or two well-known websites, are the websites, or I can never know what the right terminology is about cyberspace, but there is, I think it's a Facebook group, about how well do you know your moon, and that's about the Unification Church. That's actually got a lot of good information there. It's not just people slacking them off. But the obvious thing about social media is that we don't need to have our friends sitting opposite each other the way we're sitting opposite. You can get them from any part of the globe, and you don't have to meet up with them physically. But then again, the fact that you've got this group enables you to organise these physical meetings, which they do.
It would be interesting to know, with the advent of social media, if that is encouraging more people to go to a group, people who may have, without social media, sort of just concealed on their own, but that idea that, you know, social media can bring so many people together. It'd be interesting to know whether there have been more people willing to join an Exmember group because of social media, because, you know, you can kind of dip your toe in with Facebook before you go to a meeting. It's almost the complete reverse of joining the movement in the first place. I think that's probably right. The other question is whether it might actually encourage people to join a group by giving publicity. I remember when I was researching the Unification Church in the early days, there were two kind of improbable people that had come along to this seminar. In fact, the Unification Church didn't seem to want these two to join, because they weren't very bright. I think they were unemployed. They were looking for somewhere to live, and that's not what they were after. And I think they may even have been psychologically disturbed. So a new religion won't want to get a reputation for attracting the wrong people. But they had come along, and I had asked them, what brought you here? Weren't you put off by the bad publicity the Unification Church was getting? And they said, oh no, what we had heard actually made us interested and want to come. So there can be the kind of reverse effect. You might think, well, I wonder what this is about. Yeah. It's really, I just think social media is just, taken a completely different road for so much of our study, particularly with testimony and people being able to, share their voice and share their opinion. Before we finish up, you're presenting today at BASR. Is there anything from your paper you would like to add to the talk that we haven't discussed so far?
Well, I think how long have we been talking now? It's been a lot more than 20 minutes. My talk is only 20 minutes, so I think I've probably added quite a bit. It's actually going to be part of a chapter in the anthology on the inside and outside the debate that Stephen Gregg and I are getting together. So there will be a kind of longer discussion. What I will be saying in the paper also, which we didn't cover, but it's a bit more technical, is about the kind of typologies of Exmember. Because people like David Bromley and Massimo Intravigna distinguish between different types. And they distinguish on the basis of how the person came out of the movement and what sort of conditions made them come out. What I'm suggesting is that these typologies have got their limitations. Sociologists talk about ideal types, and I think that's one of the problems about sociology. When have you got an ideal type, and when have you just got a model that's too crude for the purposes that you're using it? So I think an account of ex-members has got to go beyond distinctions like the defector, the ordinary leave taker, the apostate. There are all sorts of types of leaver depending on the identity that they've created for themselves within the movement. Well, so, whether they're just an unbaptized publisher, as the kind of lowest rank is called in the Jehovah's Witnesses, or whether you're one of the 144,000 in the governing body right at the top. So, these kind of distinctions of the type of member you are will affect the way you leave. It will also affect the story you give about leaving and about life in the organisation.
This almost sort of, an identity sort of wave. I was this, and then that's infected how my identity has then come out of the movement. I think your talk is going to be so interesting. I'm very excited.
Well, I hope so.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks again for the invitation.
It's our pleasure.
Excellent to hear that interview there. It was excellent to meet Breann face to face for the first time in Chester at the BASR conference, and excellent to hear the paper that George gave on which that podcast was based. So
yeah, and Breann will also be interviewing at the AASR, the Australian annual conference, very soon. Should have checked the date before we went to air, but what can you do?
We covered it there, covered it nicely. We don't have too much news for you at the moment, folks, because we're into that period of the year where everything's just sort of plodding along mechanically, but we're still keeping the podcast coming out, still keeping our responses. We still have the Opportunities Digest, although as we record, I am late with last week's one, so apologies for that, but you're going to get it before this comes out.
Yeah, indeed. It's, we're running to keep up on lots of fronts at the moment, so it's not a time for new developments. But hopefully we'll have some ideas and some stuff later in the year.
Yeah, I think we've only really got about 4 weeks left before we get to our festive special. So,
oh dear.
And I know a lot of you map your year out by the RSP festive special.
Yeah. Who can blame you? I am mapping my year out by trying to find time to edit the Christmas special. It's going to be quite the spectacle this year. But we've got a few weeks still to go. Do consider supporting the project if you're using it in your teaching or your learning through our Patreon page.
And do come back next week to hear the final episode in our NGOs series, once again conducted by Catherine Shear and Giuseppe Bellotta. And this time it's with Elena Shi speaking on Christian evangelical organizations in global anti-trafficking networks. So that's going to be quite heavy stuff, but good stuff.
Yeah, we've got some lighter ones before we get to the end of the year as well, so it all balances out. As ever, thanks for listening. The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett and our Opportunities Digest by Jana Shuley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.